So, why does this congregation exist? It exists to be an intentionally welcoming congregation of diverse faiths and shared values, fostering spiritual growth, community action, racial equity, and universal justice. Some of you will recognize that as the mission statement of this congregation. For those of you who may be either visiting or zooming in as guests, that mission statement tells you something about who these people are. A mission is a reason for being, right? And it is to that mission that you are all accountable. Did you know that? When you make an org chart of a UU congregation, you know what goes on top? The mission statement, because the mission statement is what you are all accountable to. Everything you do as members. Do you want to grow and thrive? Do you want to work toward your aspirational vision of building a loving and supportive multicultural community, creating thriving shared ministries, dismantling white supremacy, racism, and all intersecting oppressions, and widening your spiritual horizons? That's your vision statement, in case you didn't recognize it. All you have to do is keep your mission and your vision at the forefront of all of your words, actions, and decisions. Well, maybe you need to do a little more than that, because we are living in a very complicated time. We find ourselves in what transition ministers are fond of calling a liminal time. That means being on the verge of something new, in the midst of a transition. We thought we were emerging from pandemic. Maybe we are about to go round 3 or round 10, I've lost track. We are reaping the tragic harvest of our inability to slow climate change. And who knows what is going to happen in the 2024 election. There is no doubt that our planet, our nation, and our local communities need a thriving and powerful form of Unitarian Universalism to help guide this transition. And that means being amazingly flexible and adaptive. We may need to question every assumption we have ever made about congregational life in particular and Unitarian Universalism in general. Several years ago, many of us read a book edited by the Reverend Fred Muir called Turning Point, Essays on a New Unitarian Universalism. Fred envisions our future as one marked by 3 things, a trinity if you will: generosity, pluralism, and imagination. He wrote, to arrive at this future, we must liberate ourselves from a past that, while bright and bold for some, no longer serves Unitarian Universalism's dream of being a vibrant 21st century faith. In fact, this past is replete with errors shaped by a trinity: individualism, exceptionalism, and a posture of anti-authoritarianism. These errors have become barriers preventing us from embracing our future. Now, the first principle in our current and evolving statement of principles and purposes calls us to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That is a core tenet of our faith that we inherited from Ralph Waldo Emerson, that 19th century transcendentalist who developed his philosophy of individualism at the time that our nation was developing its philosophy of democracy. Fred Muir says the philosophy, theology, and spirituality of Emersonian individualism, that is, the uniqueness and joy of individual differences, called individuality, became instead an ideology, a creed, and a dogma of both the United States and Unitarian Universalism. And it is now corrupting both with a short-sighted and shallow vision. The idolization of the individual at the expense of the common good is the shadow side of our first principle, just as it is the shadow side of American democracy. Individualism as a primary is not a sustainable ideology. It separates us rather than uniting us. It encourages and I think even creates citizens and congregants who believe that they are entitled to whatever they want whenever they want it, with no ability to empathize with each other, listen to each other, care for and about each other, or tend to the most vulnerable. Now, how many of you read David Brooks in the New York Times? Any of you? So, 10 years ago, if you had told me I'd be quoting David Brooks in a sermon at a Unitarian, shows you how much times have changed. But this is what David Brooks wrote a while ago. Could today's version of America have been able to win World War II? It hardly seems possible. That victory required national cohesion, voluntary sacrifice for the common good, and trust in institutions and each other. America's response to COVID suggests that we no longer have sufficient quantities of any of those things. Americans have always been an individualistic people who didn't like being told what to do, but in times of crisis, they have historically still had the capacity to form what Alexis de Tocqueville called a social body, a coherent community capable of collective action. Brooks then goes on to talk about people who have refused to be vaccinated against COVID. He says this, Derek Thompson of The Atlantic recently conducted interviews with more than a dozen people who were refusing to get the COVID vaccine. They often used an argument you've probably heard too. I'm not especially vulnerable. I may have already gotten the virus. If I get it in the future, it won't be that bad. Why should I take a risk on an experimental vaccine? They are reasoning from a personal basis. They are thinking about what's right for them as individuals more than about what's right for the nation and the most vulnerable people in it. It's not that they are rebuking their responsibilities as citizens in this crisis. It apparently never occurred to them that they had any. Those are pretty damning words. We could have had such a different experience of the pandemic were it not for the plague of individualism in our country. Now, I've served many UU congregations, as Liz said, over the years, and I have served in many capacities at the denominational level, and I've seen the many ways that we have been stymied by this culture of individual entitlement. For years, I agreed with those in our movement who thought that we ought to, at the very least, flip the order of our 7 principles. If we started with a covenant to affirm and promote the interdependent web of all existence and made that primary, we might do better at creating congregations of people committed to the common good. We might do better at articulating and honoring our covenants, those promises we make to each other and about how we will be when we are together. We might be better at welcoming new people and integrating new people into the life of our congregations. We might be better at asking each other to make a sacrificial commitment to our beloved communities. Now, for the past several years, we, across the board in Unitarian Universalism, have been engaged in a process of revisioning our reason for being at the larger level. Article 2 of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association currently includes what we fondly call the 7 principles and 6 sources, and which we sometimes mistakenly believe have always been there. They have not. When we voted on that language back in 1987, we did not vote for it to be etched in stone. Those words represented an evolution from previous statements. They captured our best intentions at that time, but we also wrote into that process an expectation that we would regularly review that statement and that we would continue to attempt to capture our best intentions as they had evolved at that time. So a group of people were given the task of looking at Article 2 and studying it, and this is what they wrote about how they understood their charge. For some religious institutions, the equivalent of Article 2 would be regarded as a permanent statement of belief. Ours, however, is a living tradition. We commit ourselves to regularly revisiting our principles and purposes to ensure that we are relevant, that as we grow in understanding, our principles and purposes grow too. Since new occasions teach new duties, we must continuously examine them to see what is missing, what is no longer important, and whether the language communicates our core values to the current time. We are now well into the first quarter of the 21st century. Our association has grown in its understanding of systemic oppressions, such as racism, ableism, and heteronormative beliefs. However, many people feel that the current language of Article 2 does not reflect those learnings, and the UUA board believes we need an Article 2 which leads us into our future. Now, I personally love the new proposed language for Article 2. I love that it focuses on our shared values. I love that you can create a graphic of those values that looks like a flower and places love at the very heart of the statement. That would be the pistil, stamen. Who are the gardeners? You know the middle of the flower? Yeah. And that graphic is on your order of service, and it might even appear on the screen if technology blesses us. Let's see. It's coming. We practice this. Yeah.
It's coming.
So, not only do I love the language, but I love that the process of assessing, yes, there it is. Isn't that beautiful? Assessing the current statement and then proposing an alternative was a very deliberate and intentional and inclusive process. The Article 2 Study Commission took the time to listen to many of you. They got 10,000 discrete pieces of written feedback, and they read them all, and they incorporated some of them into the next to final product. The process of discussion at our recent General Assembly in Pittsburgh, you were there with anyone else at General Assembly? Oh, I know you were there. Well, it was a civil and respectful, while being deep and heartfelt conversation. Barry was so enthusiastic about it that I asked him for some words about it. And you have to understand that this is the first time we had been to a General Assembly in person since 2017, and being GA junkies, we were just so excited to be in a room with all these people. And many of the processes had changed, and we thought for the better. So this is what Barry wrote. He loved this year's General Assembly. He thought our leadership did a terrific cat-herding job, enabling on-site and at-home delegates to focus on and debate two complex and challenging subjects, right? The proposed changes to Article 2 and a resolution requiring the Common Endowment Fund to divest from companies involved in the fossil fuel industry. General Assembly made very good use of technology, providing tools for electronic voting and information access and excellent and responsive text support. The conversations about both of those complicated subjects were deep and passionate. And in the end, the delegates voted overwhelmingly to move the Article 2 language for another year of study and conversation before a final vote at next year's General Assembly, which will be all virtual, because that is another decision that has been made to alternate in-person and virtual General Assemblies. And do you know why? Because equity. Many more people can participate in a virtual General Assembly than can afford to travel, pay for hotels, restaurant meals. So many more people get to participate in the virtual General Assemblies. Now, one of the co-chairs, I didn't pay you to come here this morning. You're doing a really good job, Mia. Thank you. One of the co-chairs of that study commission is the Reverend Cheryl Walker. And she is also by chance, an author of an essay in Fred Muir's book. She is an African American who grew up in a family committed to the Nation of Islam. And she described the strength and pride and security that came from being part of a religious community that valued conformity above all. But in the end, she could not locate herself in that conformity. Her religious pilgrimage, luckily for us, eventually brought her to Unitarian Universalism. At first, she talked about how thrilled she was to find this faith that was so much the opposite of her childhood experience. Freedom. Freedom to explore, to challenge, to be a skeptic, to be a doubter, to be a heretic. And then Cheryl encountered that shadow side of our faith. She wrote, "There was no discipline of faith. It required little of me. This group of people had no cohesion beyond the single congregation, and even within the congregations, there was little or no cohesion. Everyone had come thinking that this religion was made just for them. Therefore, everyone thought everything should be for them. This wasn't individuality, it was individualism, the worship of the individual." End quote. Now, what is the antidote to this worship of the individual? Centering our mission is part of that antidote when faced with a decision, be it about the use of resources, about programs, about relationships. What every Unitarian Universalist should be asking themselves is not, is this something I want? They should be asking themselves, does this further our mission? Centering our faith on our covenants is also a part of the antidote. Practicing a covenantal faith means making promises and keeping promises, and inevitably, because we're human beings, breaking those promises, then holding ourselves and each other accountable for the brokenness, and leading ourselves and each other back into right relationship. Now, you see a quote at the top of your order of service from the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, who was recently elected president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. I asked that that statement be printed at the top of the order of service, but the next sentence in her statement I'm going to read to you. She said, "I believe in a Unitarian Universalism that draws on its noble heritage of freedom, reason, and justice to be nimble in responding to the needs of our living tradition." Living tradition, that means nothing's etched in stone. Nothing. You don't get to say about anything, this is the way we've always done it, so we should keep doing it that way. Everything is open to question. Our leaders are calling us to a mission-driven, covenantal process of transformation. Reverend Dr. Betancourt certainly invited that in her statement, and that statement, by the way, came from her campaign materials. At the end of her essay, Cheryl Walker wrote, "True community doesn't happen unless everyone is willing to give up some of their identity as an individual to take on the identity of the group. It doesn't mean we go to the extremes of everyone wearing the same clothing, everyone praying the same way, if at all, or everyone believing the same things. If we were to do that, we would give up what makes us unique, us Unitarian Universalists, in the religious landscape. However, it does mean that we move individualism from the center of our focus and replace it with a new concept of shared community in which everyone gives up a little so that we can gain together a whole lot. In true community, we gain a lot." In other words, we continue to reject the need for conformity. That's who we have always been, although it has manifested itself in different ways through the decades, as we continue to affirm our shared values. And those are the values articulated by the Article 2 Commission: interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice, all rooted in love. Now, over the next year, there will be many opportunities for each one of you to engage with the new Article 2 language. Watch for communications from the Unitarian Universalist Association. I see this process of change as one of many opportunities to practice communal care in the service of transforming and strengthening our faith for the 21st century. Because a strong and transformed Unitarian Universalism just might save us and those we love, and even our planet, which is in desperate need of saving. One more quote, this from the outgoing UUA president, the Susan Frederick Gray, at her closing words at General Assembly. "This is no time to go it alone. We belong to each other. We need each other, and we make each other strong and brave. May we continue to nurture resiliency and joy in our spirits and in our communities. May it give us courage and clarity to be more effective in protecting our loved ones, our communities, our neighbors, this planet, and our democracy. May we continue to grow our souls and ourselves, faithfully becoming beloved community." Well, that's a big order. But that is, in essence, what Unitarian Universalism has always been about, and what Unitarianism and Universalism separately had always been about. My brother and I, hi Rob, I know he's there on Zoom, we grew up in the Community Church of New York, starting in the 1950s. My name and Robbie's name are engraved on what they used to call the cradle roll when a baby was born. That form of Unitarianism that we grew up with doesn't look or feel anything like today's. But that has not been a loss. That has been progress. That has been a reflection of the world changing, individuals changing. You know, I had never seen a woman minister. I know there were a few around, but I'd never seen one. I think that's why ministry was my second career and not my first career, because it never occurred to me when I graduated from high school that I could do this. And so I invite you into this ongoing process of growing your souls and growing faithful, beloved communities. May it always be so.